The carriage stopped too fast, and Alara Whitmore nearly fell out of her own seat before the door had even opened. She did not wait for the footman. She stepped down onto the gravel with a leather ledger pressed against her chest like a shield, and she looked up at the tall iron gates of Ashworth House with her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat. She had rehearsed the apology on the ride over, 40 minutes of practicing the same 12 sentences until they lost all meaning. Now, standing in front of the house that could ruin her family with a single signature, every one of those sentences had vanished from her mind. A man in a dark coat opened the gate before she could knock. He did not smile. He did not ask her name. He simply said, "The Duke is expecting you," and turned to walk ahead of her, as if her arrival was already an old story he was tired of telling. Alara followed him up the stone steps, gripping the ledger tighter. Inside, the house was colder than the morning air outside. Her boots echoed on the marble floor, and she noticed something strange almost immediately. The walls along the main hallway were lined with faint, pale rectangles where paintings had clearly once hung. Someone had taken them all down. Recently, by the look of the untouched dust around each empty space. She wanted to ask why, she did not. The man in the dark coat led her to a drawing room at the end of the hall and left her there without another word. The door clicked shut behind her, and for a moment, Alara was alone with a fireplace that was not lit and a silence that felt heavier than any noise could have been. Then the door on the far side of the room opened, and the Duke walked in. Cassius Ashworth was younger than she expected. She had pictured someone gray and stooped, the way her father had always described men who ruined other men over unpaid debts. Instead, the man standing in front of her could not have been more than 34, tall, composed, dressed in black without a single wrinkle out of place. His face gave away nothing. Not anger, not curiosity, nothing at all. He did not offer her a seat. "Miss Whitmore," he said. His voice was quiet, almost gentle, which somehow made it worse. "You came alone." "I came to apologize," Alara said, and immediately hated how small her voice sounded in the enormous room. She held up the ledger as if it could speak for her. "For my father, for what he owes you. I know it is a great deal of money, and I know we cannot repay it all at once, but I wanted you to know that we intend to. Every shilling. I have brought the accounts so you can see exactly where things stand." The Duke looked at the ledger in her hands, but he did not reach for it. "The money," he said slowly, "was never the debt I cared about." Alara blinked. "I do not understand." "I know you do not," he said, and something in his tone told her that he did not intend to explain further. "Not now, perhaps not ever. Sit down, Miss Whitmore. You look as though you might fall over." She did not sit. Some stubborn part of her refused to obey a man she did not yet trust, even though her knees felt weak enough to buckle. "What did my father take from you, if not money?" For a long moment the Duke said nothing. He walked to the cold fireplace and stood with his back to her, looking at the empty mantel where a portrait had clearly once hung. When he spoke again, his voice had changed. It was still quiet, but there was something underneath it now, something tight and controlled like a rope pulled taut. "He took the only thing I asked him not to touch. That was all. No name, no explanation. Just those 9 words, dropped into the silence like a stone into still water, and then the Duke turned back to face her as if he had said nothing important at all. Alara opened her mouth to ask what he meant, but something in his eyes stopped her. A warning, maybe, or a plea. She could not tell which, and she found she did not have the courage to test it. "You will stay for dinner," the Duke said, and it was not a question. "I was not invited to stay." "You are now." Alara felt her pulse quicken, though she could not have said whether it was fear or something else entirely. She glanced down at the ledger in her hands, at the ink stains on its cover where she had spilled tea over it years ago while helping her father with the family accounts, back when the family still had accounts worth keeping. She held onto it the way a drowning person holds onto driftwood. "I only came to discuss the debt," she said again, quieter this time. And we will discuss it, the Duke said. Over dinner. There is no reason for you to travel all the way back to Whitmore House tonight only to return tomorrow. My staff will prepare a room for you. A room. You look surprised. I did not expect to be staying the night in the house of the man my father owes a fortune to. For the first time since she had walked through the door, something flickered across the Duke's face. It was not quite a smile. It was something smaller, sharper, gone almost before she could name it. Miss Whitmore, he said, your father owes me a great deal more than a fortune, and I intend to collect on all of it, starting with dinner. There was no threat in his voice. That was the strange part. He said it the way another man might comment on the weather, calm and certain, as though the outcome had already been decided and all that remained was for her to catch up. Alara did not know what to say to that. So she said nothing at all, and when the man in the dark coat returned a few minutes later to show her to a guest room, she followed him without argument, the ledger still clutched against her chest, her mind spinning through every terrible possibility of what 9 strange words could mean. The guest room was larger than her entire bedroom back home. A fire had already been lit, and a dress had been laid out across the bed, deep green silk, clearly expensive, clearly not something she had brought with her. She stared at it for a long moment before realizing what it meant. Someone had known she would stay before she had agreed to anything. She sat on the edge of the bed and opened the ledger across her knees, running her finger down the columns of numbers she had memorized so many times she could recite them in her sleep. Debts. Interest. More debts. Her father's handwriting grew messier toward the bottom of each page, the ink blotted where his hand must have shaken. She thought of her father's face the morning he told her what he had done. He had not cried. He had simply sat very still at the kitchen table, staring at his own hands, and said, I have made a terrible mistake, and I do not know how to undo it. He had never told her what the mistake truly was, only the number attached to it. A knock came at the door. Alara closed the ledger quickly, as if it were something to be ashamed of, and called for whoever it was to enter. A young woman came in, carrying a basin of warm water and a soft cloth, and began preparing the room for the evening without being asked. She did not speak much, but at one point, as she was pinning back the curtains, she glanced at Alara and said quietly, You are the first guest this house has had in 3 years, miss. Alara sat up straighter. 3 years. The woman's face closed immediately, as though she had said more than she meant to. I should not have said that. Forgive me. She finished her work quickly and left the room without another word, leaving Alara alone again with far more questions than she had arrived with. 3 years. Whatever had happened in this house, whatever the Duke meant by the only thing I asked him not to touch, it had frozen this place in time. The empty walls, the unlit fireplace in the drawing room, a man who spoke about debts the way other men spoke about grief. Alara looked at the green silk dress laid out on the bed, and for the first time since stepping into the carriage that morning, the fear in her chest was joined by something else, something that felt dangerously close to curiosity. Dinner was announced by the same man in the dark coat, who introduced himself this time only as Barnaby, and nothing more. Alara wore the green dress because there was nothing else to wear, and because some stubborn instinct told her that refusing it would be its own kind of admission, though of what, she could not say. The dining room was as cold and empty of decoration as the rest of the house. A single long table stretched between them, far too large for 2 people, with the Duke seated at one end and a single place set for Alara near the middle, close enough that conversation would not require raised voices, but not so close that it suggested any warmth. You did not have to seat me so far, Alara said as she sat down. I did not seat you at all, the Duke replied. Barnaby did. Take it up with him if it displeases you. It was, she realized with some surprise, almost a joke. She looked at him carefully, searching his composed face for any sign that he meant it lightly, and found only the faintest shadow of amusement around his eyes before it vanished again. They ate in near silence for the first several minutes. Ilara found herself staring at her own hands more than her food, turning her fork over without eating, her mind still circling the 9 words he had given her in the drawing room. Finally, unable to bear the silence any longer, she set down her fork. "You said my father took the only thing you asked him not to touch." "I did. Will you tell me what that means?" The Duke was quiet for a long moment, studying her across the table with an expression she could not read. "No," he said finally, "not tonight." "Then when?" "When I decide you are ready to hear it." Ilara felt a flash of anger rise in her, hot and sudden, and for once she did not try to smother it. "You invited me into your house. You are keeping me here overnight in a dress that is not mine, and you will not even tell me why my family is being punished." "Your family is not being punished," the Duke said, and for the first time his voice sharpened just slightly, just enough for her to hear the edge beneath it. "Your father is. He is my father. Whatever debt he owes, it falls to me now. That is why I came. Not to argue with you about the past, but to settle what he owes so my family can begin to recover." The Duke set down his own fork very carefully, as though the gesture required all of his concentration. When he looked at her again, something in his expression had shifted, though she could not name what. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "I did not ask you here tonight to discuss numbers. I have a proposal for you. One that has nothing to do with the ledger you have been carrying around this house like a piece of armor." Ilara's stomach dropped. What kind of proposal? The Duke did not answer right away. He simply watched her, his gray eyes steady and unreadable, while the candles between them burned lower, and the silence stretched out across the enormous empty table like something alive, waiting to see which one of them would break it first. "I am listening," Ilara said, though her voice came out thinner than she wanted it to. "Marry me," the Duke said. The words landed in the room like a dropped plate, sharp and final, and for a moment Ilara simply stared at him, certain she had misheard. When he said nothing more, when his expression did not change, when he simply waited with the calm patience of a man who had already decided the conversation would go exactly this way, she understood that she had heard him perfectly. "That is not funny," she said. "I did not intend it to be. You cannot be serious. I am rarely anything else." Ilara pushed back from the table, her chair scraping loudly against the floor, and stood without quite meaning to. "You want me to marry you in exchange for my father's debt? Is that what this is? Some arrangement where I become part of your household in place of a payment you know he cannot make?" "It is not an exchange," the Duke said. "It is a proposal. There is a difference, though I understand why you might not see it tonight." "Explain the difference to me, then. Because from where I am standing, it sounds exactly the same as buying a horse." Something flickered across his face again, that same brief, sharp thing she had seen earlier, gone before she could study it properly. "If I wanted your father's debt settled, Miss Whitmore, I would simply forgive it. I have that power. I have had it for months. I have not used it." "Then why not?" "Because forgiving the debt would end this," the Duke said, gesturing faintly between them, though Ilara could not have said what this referred to. "And I am not finished." She sat back down slowly, mostly because her legs no longer felt steady enough to hold her. "Finished with what? You still have not told me anything. Not what my father did, not why you want to marry a woman you met an hour ago, not why this house looks like nobody has lived in it in years. You ask me to agree to something enormous, and you give me nothing to agree to it with." The Duke was quiet for a long moment, turning his wine glass slowly between 2 fingers without drinking from it. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost some of its careful control, just enough for Ilara to notice. "My mother sat in that chair you are sitting in now," he said. "Every night for as long as I can remember until 3 years ago. She does not sit there anymore." Ilara's breath caught. "Is she?" She is alive, the Duke said quickly before the question could finish forming. But she is not here, and your father knows exactly why, even if you do not. Then tell me. Not tonight, he said again, and this time his voice left no room for argument. He set down the wine glass and folded his hands on the table, and when he looked at her, the composed mask had slipped back into place, as though the last few minutes of honesty had cost him more than he wanted her to see. Marry me, Miss Whitmore. Your father's debt disappears the day the arrangement is made. Your family keeps its name, its house, and whatever pride it has left. In return, you live here as my wife, for as long as I require it. For as long as you require it, Alara repeated slowly. That is not a marriage, that is a sentence. Call it what you like. And if I refuse? The Duke's expression did not change, but something in the room seemed to grow colder anyway. Then I collect what is owed in full within the month. Your family loses the house. Your father, I imagine, loses whatever is left of his standing among people who once respected him. And you lose the choice you are being offered right now. Alara felt anger rising in her again, but underneath it, quieter and more dangerous, she felt something close to relief. A sweet, familiar heat that steadied her hands even as her mind spun. Anger she understood. Anger she could use. It was so much easier than the fear that had carried her through the front door that morning. You are asking me to give up my entire life, she said, to save a family that has already fallen apart around me. My father barely leaves his study anymore. My mother has not spoken his name without crying in over a year. And you want me to walk away from what little is left of that and live here, in a house with no paintings on the walls, married to a man who will not even tell me why. Yes, the Duke said simply, that is exactly what I am asking. Why me? Why not simply ruin him and be done with it if you hate him so much? Because ruining him, the Duke said, would not bring back what he took. There it was again. That same unfinished sentence, dangled just out of reach, close enough to feel its weight but never close enough to understand its shape. Alara stared at him across the table, searching his face for some crack in the composure, some sign of the man underneath the title, and found only patience. Endless, immovable patience, as though he had all the time in the world to wait for her to say yes. I need time, she said finally. You have until morning. That is not time, that is a formality. It is more than most people in your position would get, the Duke said, and though his voice remained even, there was something almost weary beneath it now, as though this conversation had exhausted a part of him he rarely allowed anyone to see. Sleep on it, Miss Whitmore. The room is yours for the night regardless of your answer. Alara did not sleep. She sat by the fire in her borrowed room until the candles burned down to nothing, turning the ledger over and over in her hands, running through every version of the conversation she might have had instead, every argument she might have made that would have changed his mind. None of them felt real. None of them felt like they belonged to a world where a stranger could offer marriage across a dinner table the way another man might offer a business contract. She thought about her father, sitting alone in his study back home, unable to look her in the eye since the day the letter from Ashworth House had arrived. She thought about her mother's hollow, careful voice whenever the subject of money came up, the way the whole family had learned to speak around the debt instead of about it, as though numbing it directly might make it worse. And she thought about the empty walls of this house, the pale rectangles where paintings had once hung, a mother who no longer sat in her chair, a man who spoke about the past the way someone speaks about an old wound that has never properly healed. Whatever her father had done, it had not simply cost him money. It had cost this family something they had never gotten back, and somehow, impossibly, the Duke believed that marrying her might return a piece of it. She did not understand it, but some quiet, stubborn part of her wanted to. Near dawn, there was a soft knock at her door. She expected Barnaby, or perhaps the maid from earlier, but when she opened it, the Duke himself was standing in the hallway, still dressed as though he had not slept either, his composed face carrying the faint shadows of a long night. "You do not need to answer yet," he said before she could speak. "I only wanted to say one thing before Barnaby brings your breakfast, because I do not think I said it properly at dinner." "Say it then." "This is not revenge," he said quietly. "Whatever you think of me tonight, whatever this looks like from where you are standing, it is not revenge. I do not want to hurt you, Miss Whitmore. I do not even want to hurt your father, not truly, though I understand if you find that difficult to believe." "Then what do you want?" The Duke was silent for a long moment, his gray eyes searching her face in the dim hallway light, and when he finally answered, his voice was so quiet she almost missed it entirely. "I want to understand why he did it, and I think, somehow, you might be the only way I ever will." He did not wait for her response. He turned and walked back down the hallway, his footsteps fading into the silence of the sleeping house, and left Alara standing alone in the doorway with the first gray light of morning creeping in through the windows, and a decision she no longer felt entirely afraid to make. By the time Barnaby arrived with breakfast, Alara had made her decision, though it did not feel like a choice so much as a door closing behind her, while another one opened just wide enough to walk through. She found the Duke in the drawing room, standing near the cold fireplace exactly where she had first seen him the day before, as though he had not moved at all in the hours since. He turned when she entered, and something in his posture told her he had been expecting her to say no. "I will marry you," Alara said before her nerve could fail her, "but I want conditions." For the first time, something close to a real smile touched the corner of his mouth. "Name them." "My father's debt is forgiven the day the papers are signed, not the day the wedding happens. I do not want to spend a single night wondering if you will change your mind." "Agreed." "My mother is to be told nothing of the reasons behind this arrangement. She has enough grief without adding mine to it." "Agreed." "And you will tell me the truth eventually. Not today, not this week, but eventually. I will not spend the rest of my life living inside a house full of secrets I am not allowed to ask about." The Duke was quiet for a moment, studying her with an expression she still could not fully read. "Eventually," he said finally, "you have my word." The wedding, when it came, was small and quiet and strange in the way that only necessary things can be. There was no large gathering, no grand celebration, only a handful of witnesses and a vicar who seemed faintly confused by how little joy was present in a room meant for one of the happiest days of a person's life. Alara's mother wept through the entire ceremony, though whether from relief or grief, Alara could not say, and possibly her mother could not have said either. Her father did not attend. Alara had expected that. She had not expected how much it would still hurt. Afterward, she moved her few belongings into Ashworth House, into a bedroom 2 doors down from the Duke's own, connected by a hallway she suspected neither of them would walk very often. The house remained as cold and empty as it had been the night of her first dinner there, the same pale rectangles on the walls, the same unlit fireplaces in rooms that clearly had once been warm. She began exploring it the way a person explores a place they intend to survive rather than simply live in. She learned which floorboards creaked outside the kitchen. She learned that the library had a window seat that caught the morning sun in a way that made the whole room glow gold for exactly 1 hour each day. She learned that Barnaby, despite his stern face, kept a small dish of peppermints in his coat pocket that he handed out to the younger staff when he thought no one important was watching. And she learned, slowly, carefully, the shape of the silence that lived inside her husband. The Duke was not cruel. She had expected cruelty, given the strangeness of how their arrangement began, but he was never anything less than courteous, even kind in his own careful, distant way. He asked after her comfort each morning. He ensured the staff treated her with the respect due to the lady of the house. He never once raised his voice to her, not even during the small disagreements that inevitably arose between two strangers learning to share a home. But he disappeared for hours at a time into a wing of the house, she had not yet been shown, and he flinched, almost imperceptibly, whenever anyone mentioned his mother's name. One afternoon, nearly 3 weeks into her new life at Ashworth House, Alara found herself wandering into a part of the estate she had not yet explored, drawn by nothing more than restlessness and the particular kind of boredom that comes from living in a house too large for its own silence. She climbed a narrow staircase near the servants' quarters, expecting nothing more interesting than storage rooms, and found instead an attic filled with shapes covered in white cloth. She knew what they were before she even lifted the first sheet. Paintings. Dozens of them, stacked against the walls, wrapped and hidden away as though someone could not bear to look at them but also could not bring themselves to destroy them. She lifted the corner of the nearest cloth and found herself looking at a portrait of a woman with the Duke's same gray eyes and the same careful set of the jaw, though softened by what must have been warmth, once, before whatever happened in this house had taken it away. The woman in the painting was smiling. It was strange to see, given how little smiling seemed to happen anywhere in Ashworth House now. She moved to the next painting and found something stranger still. A family portrait, clearly older, showing a younger version of the Duke standing beside his mother and, Alara guessed, his father. But someone had taken a knife to the canvas where a fourth figure should have been. A careful, precise cut, removing a face entirely from the painting while leaving the rest of the scene intact. Alara stared at the ruined portrait for a long time, her mind turning over the strange, deliberate violence of it. Someone had not simply hidden this painting away. Someone had erased a person from it entirely, cutting them out with the same care a person might use to remove a splinter, painful and precise and final. "You should not be up here." Alara spun around, her heart lurching, to find the Duke standing in the attic doorway, his face pale in a way she had not seen before. For once, his composure had slipped completely, and what remained underneath it looked almost young, almost frightened. "I did not know," Alara said quickly, lowering the cloth back over the ruined portrait as though covering it again might undo what she had already seen. "I was only exploring. I did not mean to intrude." "It is not intrusion I am concerned about." The Duke crossed the room slowly, his eyes fixed on the covered painting rather than on her. "It is memory." "Who is missing from that painting?" He did not answer right away. He reached out and rested his hand against the covered frame, not lifting the cloth, simply resting his palm against the fabric as though it were something living that needed comforting. "My sister," he said finally, so quietly Alara almost missed it. "She is not dead if that is what you are thinking. She is simply gone, and the person who cut her out of this painting was not a stranger." Alara's breath caught. "My father." The Duke's silence was answer enough. Why would he do that? What could possibly explain cutting a person out of a family portrait? "I told you I would explain eventually," the Duke said, and his voice, though quiet, carried a warning she recognized from their first dinner together. "This is not eventually. Not yet. You cannot keep giving me pieces, and then snatching them away before I understand what they mean." "I am not snatching anything away," the Duke said, turning to face her fully now, his composure returning like a mask sliding back into place, though not quite as seamlessly as before. "I am protecting what little control I have left over a story that has already cost me more than you know. It is my story too now. You made it mine the moment you asked me to marry you." Something in his expression softened, just slightly. And for a moment, Alara thought he might actually tell her everything, right there in the dusty attic surrounded by hidden paintings and a family torn apart by whatever secret her father carried. But instead he simply said, "Come downstairs. It is getting cold up here, and Barnaby will worry if we are late for dinner." He offered his arm, an old habit of formality that felt strange given everything that had just happened between them. And after a long moment, Alara took it, because arguing further would accomplish nothing except pushing him further behind the wall he had spent 3 years building. They did not speak of the attic again for several days. though Alara found herself thinking about the ruined portrait constantly, turning it over in her mind the way she used to turn over the numbers in her father's ledger, searching for some pattern that would make the whole terrible arithmetic finally make sense. It was in the library, nearly a week later, that something shifted between them for the first time. Alara had claimed the window seat as her own in the weeks since her arrival, spending long afternoons there with whatever book Barnaby had recommended that week, enjoying the hour of golden light that spilled through the glass each day before the sun moved past the angle that made it possible. She was there, curled into the cushions with a novel open on her lap, when the Duke entered, clearly not expecting to find her there, given how quickly he stopped in the doorway. "I did not mean to intrude on your reading," he said. "You are not intruding. This is your library. It has not felt like mine in some time." He crossed the room slowly, his hands clasped behind his back in the careful, formal way he always carried himself, and stopped near the window seat, looking down at the book in her lap rather than at her face. "What are you reading?" She showed him the cover, and something like genuine interest flickered across his expression, the first she had seen since the attic. "My mother loved that book," he said quietly. "She used to read it aloud in this exact spot, though I do not suppose you knew that when you chose it." "I did not." "It is strange," he said, lowering himself slowly onto the opposite end of the window seat, close enough that Alara could feel the warmth of him even through the fabric of her sleeve. "How a house remembers things even when the people in it try very hard to forget." They sat in silence for a while after that, the golden afternoon light stretching across the floor between them, and Alara found herself sneaking glances at his profile, at the careful lines of his face, at the way his hands rested loosely in his lap when he thought no one was paying close attention. There was something almost peaceful about the silence, something that had not existed between them before, not during the tense negotiations of their first dinner, not during the strange formality of their wedding day. When his hand shifted slightly on the cushion between them, close enough that his fingers nearly brushed hers, Alara felt her breath catch in a way that had nothing to do with fear. The Duke noticed. Of course he noticed. He noticed everything in that quiet, careful way of his, and for a moment his hand hovered there, close enough to touch, close enough that the smallest movement from either of them would close the distance entirely. Then he pulled his hand back, folding it into his lap along with the other, and stood from the window seat so abruptly that Alara blinked in surprise. "Forgive me," he said, though he did not explain what exactly he was asking forgiveness for. "I have matters to attend to before dinner." He left the library without another word, his footsteps quick and uneven in a way she had not heard from him before, and Alara sat alone in the golden light with her book forgotten in her lap, staring at the empty space beside her where his hand had almost touched hers. She did not understand what had just happened, but she understood, with a certainty that settled somewhere deep and unfamiliar in her chest, that something had shifted between them in that quiet library, something neither of them had intended, and neither of them yet knew how to name. The letter arrived by accident, the way most important things in Alara's life seemed to arrive lately, sideways and unannounced, tucked into a box of old household records that Barnaby had asked her to sort through, while he dealt with a crisis in the kitchens involving a delivery of spoiled fish. She almost missed it entirely. It was folded small and pressed flat between 2 pages of an old account book, the paper yellowed with age, the ink faded but still legible. She only noticed it because the handwriting caught her eye, familiar in a way that made her stomach twist before her mind had even caught up to why. It was her father's handwriting. She should have set it aside. She should have brought it to the Duke unopened and let him decide whether she was allowed to read it. But her hands had already unfolded the paper before her better judgment could stop them, and once she saw the first line, there was no folding it back up again and pretending she had not seen. The letter was addressed to a woman named Margaret. Alara recognized the name immediately, though it took her a moment to place it. The Duke's mother. She had heard Barnaby mention it once, in passing, before quickly changing the subject. The letter itself was short, only a few lines, but each one landed like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples through everything Alara thought she understood about her family, about the debt, about the reason she was standing in this house at all. I know what I have done cannot be forgiven, her father had written. I know that no apology will ever be enough for what I took from your family, and I do not ask for one to be enough. I only ask that you believe I never meant for it to go so far. I loved her too, in my own foolish way, and I have paid for that love every day since with a debt no ledger could ever properly record. Alara read the words 3 times before their meaning settled fully into place, and when it did, she felt the floor tilt beneath her feet in a way that had nothing to do with the physical world. Her father had not simply gambled away his fortune. Whatever had happened between him and this family, it involved love. It involved someone named her, someone connected to the missing figure cut from the family portrait in the attic. It involved a debt that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with something far more personal, far more painful, something that had cost the Duke his sister and his mother's presence at this house in the same terrible stroke. Alara sat very still for a long time, the letter trembling slightly in her hands, and did not know whether to feel angry or heartbroken or simply, overwhelmingly tired. She did not go to the Duke immediately. She could not have explained why, even to herself, except that some instinct told her the moment she handed him this letter, everything between them would change in ways she was not yet ready to face. So instead she folded it carefully and tucked it into the pocket of her dress, and she did not speak to him that evening, or the evening after that, retreating instead into a silence of her own that mirrored, without her quite meaning it too, the silence he had kept from her since the day she arrived. The Duke noticed, of course. He noticed everything. On the third evening he found her in the library again, though this time she was not curled comfortably into the window seat but standing rigidly beside it, staring out at the darkening garden with her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "You have been avoiding me," he said from the doorway, making no move to enter further into the room. "I have not been avoiding you," Alara said, though the lie sat poorly in her mouth. "I have simply had a great deal to think about." "About what?" She turned to face him, and something in her expression must have given her away, because his own face shifted immediately, the careful composure cracking just slightly around the edges. "What is it?" he asked, more urgently now. "What has happened?" "I found a letter," Alara said. "In the old account books Barnaby asked me to sort. It was written by my father to your mother many years ago." The Duke went very still. What did it say? "That he loved someone in your family, that he took something from you he could never repay, and that it had nothing to do with money." She pulled the folded letter from her pocket and held it out to him, her hand shaking slightly despite her best effort to keep it steady. "It mentioned a woman, not your mother, someone else." The Duke did not take the letter. He simply stared at it in her outstretched hand as though it were something dangerous, something that might burn him if he touched it, and for a long moment neither of them moved. "My sister," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Your sister was in love with my father." "No," the Duke said, and something in his tone had turned sharp, almost brittle, in a way she had never heard from him before. "My father loved her mother. Your father was not the only one who made mistakes in this house, Miss Whitmore. He simply made the one that could not be forgiven." Alara's mind spun, trying to piece together the fragments he was giving her, but the shape of the story remained frustratingly incomplete, like a portrait with the most important figure still cut away. "I do not understand," she said. "Please just tell me plainly. I am tired of pieces. I am tired of 9-word sentences and eventually and not yet. You promised me the truth." "I know what I promised." "Then keep your word." The Duke turned away from her, walking toward the cold fireplace the way he seemed to do whenever a conversation grew too heavy to face directly. And for a long moment Alara thought he might simply leave the room without answering, the way he had fled the window seat the week before. But instead he began to speak, his voice low and controlled, though she could hear the effort it took him to keep it that way. "My sister's name is Cordelia," he said. "She was born the same year I was, though not to my mother. Her mother was a woman my father loved before his marriage, a woman he never stopped loving, even after he married for duty rather than affection. Cordelia grew up in this house believing my mother was her mother, because that was the story my family agreed to protect, for her sake as much as for ours. And my father knew the truth. Your father was my father's closest friend," the Duke said. "He knew everything. He knew about Cordelia's real mother. He knew about the arrangement. He knew all the careful lies that held this family together. And when my father died and the truth began slipping loose at the edges the way truths always do eventually, it was your father who was supposed to help protect Cordelia from the worst of it. What happened instead?" The Duke's jaw tightened. He told her himself, without warning, without any care for how the truth would land on a girl who had spent 19 years believing herself to be someone she was not. He told her in anger, during an argument I still do not fully understand the reason for, and she left this house that same night and has not returned since. Alara felt the letter grow heavy in her hand, as though the paper itself had absorbed some of the weight of what she was hearing. "Where is she now?" "I do not know," the Duke said, and for the first time his composure broke entirely, his voice cracking on the last word in a way that made Alara's chest ache in sympathy despite everything. "I have searched for 3 years. I have spent more money chasing rumors of where she might have gone than your father's entire debt could ever have covered, and every lead ends the same way. Nothing. She simply vanished, and I am left with an empty room and a portrait with her face cut out of it, because I could not bear to look at it and be reminded of what I failed to protect. That is why the paintings are covered. That is why everything in this house has been covered, in one way or another, for 3 years," the Duke said quietly. Alara stared at him, at the man who had proposed marriage to her across a cold dinner table with such calm, careful control, and understood, finally, that the control had never been coldness at all. It had been the only thing holding him together. "You married me to find her," she said slowly, the realization settling into place like the final piece of a puzzle she had not known she was solving. "You thought marrying my father's daughter might somehow lead you back to your sister." "At first," the Duke admitted. "I will not lie to you and pretend otherwise. I thought perhaps you would know something. A name, a place, some detail your father might have let slip in a careless moment. I was desperate, Miss Whitmore, and desperate men make strange bargains. And now—" He looked at her for a long moment, something raw and unguarded moving across his face in a way she had never seen from him before. "Now I am no longer certain that finding her was ever really why I asked you to stay." Alara did not know what to say to that. The anger she had carried into the room, the sharp, steadying heat of it, had somewhere in the last several minutes transformed into something else entirely, something she did not yet have the courage to name. She looked down at the letter still clutched in her hand, at her father's familiar, unsteady handwriting, and felt the full weight of everything he had never told her pressing down on her chest. "I need air," she said finally, and before the Duke could respond, she pushed past him and walked quickly out of the library, down the long cold hallway and out into the garden, where the evening had turned properly dark, and the cold bit sharply at her skin through the thin fabric of her dress. She did not cry, though she thought perhaps she should have. She simply stood in the darkness, breathing hard, the letter still crumpled in her fist, and stared up at a sky full of stars that offered no answers at all to the question now sitting heaviest in her mind. Somewhere out there was a woman named Cordelia, cut out of her own family's history by a careless truth, and somewhere inside this house was a man who had built 3 years of silence around the space she had left behind. And somewhere, tangled impossibly between the two of them, was Ilara herself, standing in a garden she had never expected to call home, holding a letter that had changed everything and answered nothing at all. Ilara did not return to the house that night until the cold had driven her back inside against her will, and even then, she avoided the library, retreating instead to her own room, where she sat by the window with her father's letter spread across her knees, and tried to make sense of a story that had grown far larger than she had ever imagined it could. She thought of her father's silence over the past year, the way he had aged what felt like a decade in a matter of months, the way he could no longer look her in the eye whenever the subject of the Ashworth family arose. She had always assumed it was shame over the money. Now she understood it was something far heavier. He had not simply lost a fortune. He had broken a promise to protect a young woman from a truth that was never his to reveal, and in doing so, he had shattered two families at once, his own included. She did not sleep much that night. When morning came, she dressed quietly and made her way down to the kitchens earlier than usual, hopping to avoid the Duke, until she had gathered her thoughts into something more coherent than the storm currently raging inside her chest. She found Barnaby there instead, sitting alone at the servant's table with a cup of tea gone cold in front of him, his usually composed face drawn with worry. "You look as though you have not slept either," Ilara said, sitting across from him. "I rarely do these days," Barnaby admitted. "This house does not make for easy rest." "You knew about Cordelia." It was not a question, and Barnaby did not treat it as one. He simply nodded slowly, his expression softening into something like relief, as though he had been waiting 3 years for someone to finally say the name aloud without flinching. "I have served this family since before the Duke was born," he said. "I watched Cordelia grow up in this house believing herself to be exactly who everyone told her she was, and I watched her leave it in the middle of the night with nothing but a small bag and a face full of a grief no young woman should ever have to carry alone. Do you know where she went?" Barnaby hesitated, and for a moment Ilara thought he might refuse to answer, the way the Duke so often did. But then he sighed, an old, tired sound, and said, "I know where she used to send letters in the first few months after she left, before even those stopped coming." Ilara's heart quickened. "Where?" "A small village near the coast. Whitcomb, I believe it was called. She had an old friend there from her school days, a woman named Alice who might still know something if she is willing to speak of it." "Does the Duke know this?" Barnaby's face grew careful again. "He knows the name of the village. He sent men there himself more than once in the early days of his search. They found nothing. Cordelia had already moved on by the time anyone arrived, and the trail went cold from there." Ilara sat back in her chair, her mind working quickly now, turning over the pieces of the story with a new kind of urgency. "But you said she wrote to this Alice." If Alice knew where she went next, even if it was only a first destination, that might be enough to follow further. "Perhaps," Barnaby said, "though I do not know what good it would do to reopen old wounds if the Duke has already made peace with not finding her." "He has not made peace with anything," Ilara said quietly. "He has simply stopped looking because looking hurt too much to continue. That is not the same thing." Barnaby studied her for a long moment, something thoughtful moving behind his careful eyes. "You care for him," he said finally, not quite a question either. Ilara did not answer right away. The truth of it sat strangely in her chest, unfamiliar and a little frightening, given how recently she had walked through the front gates of this house, believing she was only there to apologize for a debt that turned out to be so much smaller than the real one owed. "I do not fully understand what I feel," she admitted. "But I do not want to see him spend the rest of his life standing in front of covered paintings, pretending the empty spaces on the walls do not hurt him every single day." She found the Duke in his study an hour later, bent over papers he did not appear to actually be reading, his eyes fixed on some middle distance that had nothing to do with the documents in front of him. He looked up when she entered, and something in his expression braced immediately, as though he expected her to announce she was leaving. "I spoke to Barnaby this morning," Alara said before he could say anything at all. "About Whitcomb, about Alice." The Duke's face went carefully blank in the way it always did when a subject grew too tender to touch directly. "Those leads went cold 3 years ago. They went cold because you stopped following them, not because there was nothing left to find. I sent men there. I spent a fortune I did not need to spend chasing a trail that led nowhere." "You sent men," Alara said. "You did not go yourself." The Duke's jaw tightened. It would not have mattered. A hired man asking questions in a village is the same as a duke asking them in the end. "I do not think that is true," Alara said. "I think a stranger asking about a missing young woman raises suspicion. I think a family member, someone who actually loved her, might get a very different answer from someone like Alice, who was her friend." "You want to go to Whitcomb?" "I want you to go to Whitcomb," Alara said, "and I want to go with you." The Duke was quiet for a long moment, his eyes searching her face with an intensity that made her breath catch, the same way it had in the library when his hand had hovered so close to hers before pulling away entirely. "Why would you want to help me find her? After everything you learned last night, after everything my family's secrets cost your own." "Because I understand now," Alara said, "that we are not so different. You and I, we have both spent our lives cleaning up messes that were never entirely ours to clean. My father's debts, your family's silence. And I think, somewhere along the way, we both convinced ourselves that fixing the damage was the same thing as healing it. It is not. Cordelia will not come back because a debt is paid or a portrait is uncovered. She will come back, if she comes back at all, because someone finally goes looking for her with their whole heart instead of their guilt." The Duke stood slowly from behind his desk, crossing the room until he stood close enough that Alara could see the exhaustion etched into every line of his face. 3 years of searching and failing and covering paintings he could not bear to look at, all of it finally rising to the surface where she could see it plainly for the first time. "I do not know what I am doing anymore," he admitted, quietly, the composure she had grown used to slipping away entirely. "I married you to find her. I have spent every day since telling myself that was still the reason, because it was easier than admitting the truth." "What truth?" "That somewhere between our first dinner and that afternoon in the library, I stopped thinking of you as a means to an end," he said, his voice rough with something she had never heard from him before. "And I do not know what to do with that, given everything our families have already cost each other." Alara felt her own composure slipping now too, the careful distance she had maintained since reading her father's letter finally giving way beneath the weight of everything the last few days had uncovered. "Then let us find her together," she said. "Not because it fixes what our fathers broke, but because it is the right thing to do, and because I would like to see this house with paintings on its walls again, and I do not think that happens until you stop punishing yourself for a truth you never told." They left for Whitcomb 3 days later, traveling together in a single carriage for the first time since Alara's arrival at Ashworth House, and the journey passed differently than any conversation they had shared before, easier somehow, though the destination ahead of them carried no guarantee of the ending either of them hoped for. Whitcomb turned out to be a small fishing village perched along a gray, windswept coast, its narrow streets smelling of salt and old rope, its people quiet and watchful of strangers in fine carriages. It took the better part of a day to locate Alice, a woman now married with children of her own, who answered her door with obvious wariness until the Duke introduced himself, and something in his voice, some raw honesty he had not allowed himself in 3 years of hired investigators, seemed to soften her guarded expression. "She stayed with me for a few months," Alice admitted, once she had invited them in and set a pot of tea between them that none of them touched. "But she was frightened the whole time, certain someone would find her and drag her back to a life she no longer recognized as her own. She left before your men ever came asking, my lord. I am sorry. I did not know where to send word, even if I had wanted to. Do you know where she went? Alara asked gently, when the Duke seemed unable to find his own voice. Alice hesitated, glancing between the two of them with careful, searching eyes, as though weighing some old promise against the raw hope written plainly across the Duke's face. She spoke of wanting to become someone new, she said finally. Someone with no name attached to any family at all. She mentioned a town further along the coast, one large enough that a person might disappear into it entirely. I cannot promise she is still there, my lord. It has been 3 years, but it is the last true thing I know. She gave them the name, and something in the Duke's face changed the moment he heard it, some flicker of hope breaking through 3 years of careful, guarded grief. It took another 2 days of careful searching, of quiet questions asked in shops and along harbor docks before they found her. Ilara was the one who spotted her first, a young woman with the Duke's same gray eyes, standing behind the counter of a small bookshop, her dark hair pulled back simply, her face thinner and older than the smiling girl in the attic portrait, but unmistakably, achingly the same person. Ilara did not go in immediately. She found the Duke instead, waiting nervously outside, and simply pointed toward the shop window, watching his face transform from careful composure into something raw and unguarded and hopeful all at once. "Go," she said softly. "This part is not mine to be part of." He hesitated at the door for a long moment, his hand resting against the frame the same way it had rested against the covered portrait in the attic weeks before, and then he pushed it open and stepped inside. Ilara did not follow. She stood outside in the cool coastal air, watching through the window as Cordelia looked up from her work, her expression shifting from polite customer service to something like shock, and then, slowly, cautiously, to something that might have been the beginning of forgiveness. She could not hear what was said between them. She did not need to. She could see it in the way Cordelia's shoulders, held so rigidly at first, began to soften, in the way the Duke's hands, always so carefully controlled, trembled slightly as he reached out and did not quite touch his sister's arm, waiting for her permission first. In the long, careful silence that stretched between them before Cordelia finally stepped forward and closed the distance herself. Ilara turned away from the window then, giving them privacy for a reunion 3 years in the making, and walked slowly along the harbor, watching the gray water churn against the docks, thinking of empty walls and covered paintings and a debt that had never truly been about money at all. They returned to Ashworth House 2 weeks later, Cordelia traveling with them. Hesitant but willing, uncertain of what waited for her in the home she had fled but no longer entirely afraid of finding out. The staff wept openly when she walked through the front doors, and even Barnaby, so carefully composed in all the months Ilara had known him, had to turn away for a moment to hide the shine in his eyes. It was Ilara who suggested, a few days later, that they uncover the paintings. They did it together, the 3 of them, pulling white cloths away from portrait after portrait until the walls of Ashworth House were finally, properly full again, faces long hidden finally allowed to look out into rooms that had missed them. The ruined family portrait, the one with Cordelia's face cut away, they left covered, agreeing without needing to discuss it that some wounds should be replaced rather than repaired. Instead, weeks later, a new portrait was commissioned, not of the family as it had once been, but as it was now. The Duke, composed but visibly lighter than he had been in years. Cordelia, still healing but present, real, no longer a careful absence in every room. And Ilara, standing slightly apart from them both, holding not a ledger this time, but nothing at all, her hands finally empty of debts and apologies and secrets that were never truly hers to carry. They hung it in the drawing room, above the fireplace that had finally, after 3 long years, been properly lit again. Ilara found the Duke there one evening, standing before the new portrait with an expression she had never quite seen on his face before, something unguarded and peaceful and entirely, unlike the careful composure of the man who had once offered her marriage across a cold dinner table, as though it were nothing more than a transaction. "I never thanked you," he said quietly, without turning to look at her. "For coming here, for coming with me to Whitcomb, for refusing to let me stay hidden behind covered paintings for the rest of my life." "You do not need to thank me," Alara said, coming to stand beside him, close enough this time that when his hand found hers in the warm firelight, neither of them pulled away. They stood there together for a long while, watching the flames catch and dance in a hearth that had sat cold and empty for 3 long years, saying nothing at all, because for the first time since Alara had walked through the gates of Ashworth House carrying a ledger full of debts she thought could explain everything, there was finally nothing left that needed explaining.